If there's no self or substance that passes from one life to another, what makes a consciousness arising in another life continuous with a present life, rather than simply a new and separate process? Theravada Buddhism holds that the consciousness present at death ceases, and the rebirth linking consciousness is neither the same as nor entirely unrelated to it. The final mental conditions at death, together with relevant past intentions, help condition the new consciousness. If those conditions had not been present, that particular rebirth would not have occurred. The question, then, is how causation can continue after both the body and the present consciousness have ceased. What exactly is the status of one's accumulated karma? Theravada Abhidharma identifies karma with volition, cetana, or intentional mental acts. Once a particular act of volition has ceased, it is no longer present, even though it can still condition later results. Past intentional volitions therefore provide a karma condition that helps shape the general character of a new existence, while the final consciousness provides the immediate condition for the rebirth linking consciousness. There is no enduring carrier over and above this continuum of conditions. Nothing remains between a past volition and a later rebirth in order to carry karmic power or information from one life to the next. The connection is instead said to follow from the general principle that events arise depending on causes and conditions. An important basis for belief in rebirth, then, is the claimed meditative recollection of previous lives. Without such evidence, it may be difficult for many of us to see how one event can cause another event separated from it in space-time, without anything persisting in between. But again, the real challenge is what makes this later consciousness the continuation of an earlier consciousness, rather than merely another event produced within the same causal order. A past intention and a later rebirth linking consciousness may be directly related by karma, but still there would be nothing within the later consciousness itself that makes it the successor of a previous life. It would count as that successor because it stands in the appropriate causal relation to the preceding continuum and to the karma that conditions it. Theravada therefore affirms causal continuity without personal or substantial identity. If one requires an enduring entity that makes the later consciousness belong to the earlier person, Theravada rejects that requirement as based on the very notion of self it is seeking to avoid. Nevertheless, the Mahayana tradition of Yogacara offers a substantially different account of rebirth than the more austere Theravada model. Yogacara thinkers posited the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, as the continuing basis in which karmic dispositions are retained. The alaya vijnana is a beginningless but moment-by-moment stream of consciousness in which karmic seeds are carried forward. These seeds are dispositions produced by intentional actions and are capable of ripening into later experiences. Death is therefore not an absolute break between disconnected consciousnesses, but a change in the bodily basis of a continuing sequence of causally connected mental events. The alaya is not a soul or metaphysical essence. Each moment of consciousness arises and ceases while conditioning the next, so it's not that there is any persistence of a numerically identical entity. The alaya stream performs the role of a carrier, even though no individual moment of consciousness ever survives. Karmic dispositions are transmitted through a sequence of new seed-bearing mental states, including across the death of one body and the arising of another. A later life thus belongs to a particular continuum because it develops from the immediately preceding moments of that same stream of volitions. The obvious objection to this is that a consciousness carrying karmic information across lives can sound like a subtle self. Yogacara responds to this objection through its doctrine of the three natures. Causal continuity and karmic results are conventionally real. They function in ordinary experience, though they do not exist independently. They belong to the dependent nature, paratantra, the realm of phenomena arising through causes and conditions. What Yogacara denies is their intrinsic existence, that is, existence through an independent nature of their own. Mistaking things for independently existing entities, especially by imposing a rigid division between subject and object, is the imagined nature, parikalpita. And finally, the perfected nature, parinishpana, is the dependent process correctly understood, empty of the imagined subject-object division imposed upon it. The alaya can therefore perform some functions commonly associated with a self without becoming permanent or independent. But all this raises more questions. If karma and causal continuity explain how another life can arise without a self passing between lives, what happens when awakening removes the conditions for any further life? If nothing is reborn after the death of an arahant, what exactly is final nibbana? And what became of the Buddha after his death? When an ordinary person dies, the present physical and mental processes are followed by new aggregates because ignorance and craving remain. These include physical form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. In a fully awakened person, or arahant, greed, hatred, delusion, craving, and ignorance have been uprooted. As a result, no rebirth-linking consciousness arises after death. The aggregates cease and are not renewed. This is called parinibbana, or final nibbana. Nibbana is not a condition possessed by an arahant after death. It is unconditioned, that is, not produced by causes, and is realized during life as freedom from greed, hatred, and delusion. Parinibbana is the final cessation of the aggregates, and there is no liberated subject remaining after death to experience nibbana. If there were no such thing as rebirth, the death of an arahant would appear to be indistinguishable from ordinary biological death. In both cases, the body and conditioned consciousness would cease permanently. In Theravada, however, the crucial difference is that ordinary death is followed by renewed aggregates, because ignorance and craving remain, whereas an arahant's death is not. Buddhism denies that parinibbana is annihilation, because there is no enduring self or substance that first exists and is then destroyed. Nevertheless, many forms of materialism likewise deny an enduring self and hold that consciousness depends on the body and ends when the body dies. The early Buddhist texts classified doctrines, such as that of Ajita Kesakambali, as annihilationist, and later Buddhist traditions likewise characterized materialist views associated with the Charvaka tradition as annihilationist. They were classed as annihilationist insofar as they identified the person with the body and held that the person was destroyed when the body died. Theravada's rejection of annihilationism rests principally on its denial that an enduring self exists and is subsequently destroyed. It also distinguishes ordinary death from parinibbana by holding that ignorance and craving continue to condition rebirth for an unenlightened person, whereas in the arahant those conditions have been extinguished. If rebirth is rejected, this second distinction disappears, although the philosophical difference between denying a self and asserting the destruction of a self remains. Final nibbana is therefore understood not as the destruction of a person, but as the cessation of a conditioned process because its sustaining causes have ended. It could be argued that a more philosophically robust way to differentiate ordinary materialist death from final death in Buddhism would be to say that at parinibbana, but not at ordinary death, there is not mere nothingness, because nibbana is an unconditioned dharma realized by the Buddha. For materialism, by contrast, there is no unconditioned dimension of reality. But the issue with this for Theravada is that the Buddha does not continue in an unconditioned state, because nibbana is not a kind of consciousness. After parinibbana, no continuing person, consciousness, or subject can be identified with nibbana. So, if nibbana is not any kind of self-present state of being, then what is nibbana? In Theravada, nibbana is described in two closely related ways, as the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion, and as the unconditioned element, usankutta dhatu, directly realized by supramundane path and fruition consciousness. These are not two separate nibbanas, but rather two ways of describing the same reality. Nibbana is called cessation because realizing it extinguishes the defilements that sustain suffering and rebirth. Yet it is also an unconditioned Dharma, a reality that is not produced, altered, or destroyed by any conditions. When path consciousness realizes Nibbana, it removes defilements according to its level of attainment. Fruition consciousness, which follows path consciousness, takes Nibbana as its object. But Nibbana itself does not arise at the moment the defilements cease. The consciousness that knows Nibbana arises dependently and ceases, but Nibbana, the unconditioned object of that consciousness, is not conditioned by the fact that it is known. So Nibbana is not caused by the cessation of greed, hatred and delusion, nor is it constituted by their absence in the way that an empty space might be constituted by the removal of objects. Nibbana is unconditioned, so its reality cannot depend on whether defilements happen to arise. If defilements had never arisen, there would be no need for a path, no bondage to overcome, and no beings to attain liberation. But still, there would be the unconditioned Nibbana. As such, cessation describes Nibbana primarily in relation to bondage and defilement. It does not define what the unconditioned element is in itself. When supramundane path and fruition consciousness take Nibbana as their object, they do not know a concept, a mere negation, or a blank non-existence. They directly know the unconditioned Dharma. Nibbana is therefore knowable, though only by a particular kind of supramundane consciousness. That knowing does not produce Nibbana, it merely realizes it. This has important implications for Theravada's understanding of reality, because conditioned dharmas are not the whole of what Theravada recognizes as real. Alongside conditioned dharmas, there is one unconditioned dharma, nibbana. Dependent arising explains why a conditioned result, suffering, does not arise when its conditions are absent, but it does not explain the existence of the unconditioned dharma. Thus, dependent arising does not exhaust the Theravada account of what is ultimately real. Theravada also does not offer a metaphysical explanation for why conditionality, the fact that phenomena arise in dependence on conditions, is possible. The principle that this being, that comes to be, is treated as a basic regularity or natural law governing conditioned dharmas. There are therefore two irreducible features of the Theravada view: the regularity by which conditioned dharmas arise and cease, and nibbana as the unconditioned end of bondage. Nibbana does not explain why conditioned arising is possible, or function as the causal source of samsara. It is neither a ground behind the world, nor a sheer absence, but the unconditioned dharma realized when the conditions of bondage are brought to an end. Theravada Abhidharma further classifies nibbana as an object condition, aramanopachaya. This means that nibbana serves as the object towards supramundane path and fruition consciousness are directed. In other words, path and fruition consciousness are characterized by their having nibbana as their object. At this point we might want to ask, why should we take the occurrence of a distinctive liberating consciousness to mean that one apprehends a real unconditioned dharma? That is, a dharma which is not merely an interpretation or a psychological effect generated by the conditioned mind. I can see three possibilities. The first is the orthodox Theravada position. Nibbana is an ultimately real and unconditioned dharma that serves as the object of path and fruition consciousness. When such consciousness arises, it directly apprehends nibbana as a real unconditioned dharma, distinct from ordinary conditioned states. The orientation of path and fruition consciousness cannot be explained without referring to the real unconditioned object that they realize. The second possibility is that nibbana is not established as a distinct unconditioned object merely because a practitioner undergoes a conditioned state experienced as cessation. The distinctive character of path consciousness might instead be explained by the transformation occurring within the conditioned mind. Nibbana would then describe the content or significance of that liberating experience rather than a separately real unconditioned dharma. This would be a more skeptical account of the Buddhist path. And the third possibility is that awakening should not be thought of as a separately existing conditioned consciousness encountering a separately existing unconditioned nibbana. Liberation may instead involve the ending of the cognitive distortion through which experience is divided into independently existing subjects and objects. Nibbana would then be neither an external object nor merely the private content of a conditioned subject, because the subject-object structure assumed by both descriptions would itself have dissolved. This interpretation anticipates one direction taken in later Mahayana thought, to which we will return to later. The point for now is that Theravada adopts a realist interpretation of Nibbana, while also denying that Nibbana is a consciousness. We can now return to the post-mortem question. What then can be said about the Tathagata when the conditioned aggregates finally end? In the Agivachagota Sutta, the Buddha refuses to affirm any of four alternatives concerning the Tathagata after death, that he exists, does not exist, both exists and does not exist, or neither exists nor does not exist. These alternatives are set aside because they all attempt to describe the Tathagata in terms that no longer apply. In particular, to say that the Tathagata does not exist risks treating the Tathagata as a substantial entity that first existed and was then destroyed. The problem here is not that a Tathagata secretly continues after death, but that the question assumes that a Tathagata can be adequately identified or located as an entity within the categories of existence and non-existence. Theravada nevertheless maintains that no new aggregates arise after an arahant's parinibbana. Consciousness, vijnana, is one of the five aggregates, and it is dependently arisen and conditioned. Therefore, when the aggregates cease without remainder, no further consciousness arises, because all consciousness is conditioned. The rejection of the four alternatives also does not mean that a surviving subject is in a state of absolute unconsciousness, or that the Tathagata should be regarded as an entity from which nothing remains. It is more accurate to say that no further conditioned vijnana arises after final nibbana. In the Agivachagota Sutta, the Buddha explains that the Tathagata cannot be reckoned in terms of form, feeling, perception, and consciousness. He is described as deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. The sutta compares the Tathagata with an extinguished fire. Once a fire has gone out because its fuel is exhausted, it is not meaningful to ask whether it has gone east, west, north, or south. The question no longer applies because the conditions by which the fire could be designated have ended. In a similar way, after final nibbana, the Tathagata cannot be classified as existing or not existing because the aggregates through which such classification occurs no longer arise. Theravada must therefore distinguish between the nibbana element with remainder and the nibbana element without remainder. During life, an arahant has realized nibbana, but the five aggregates continue as residual results of past conditions. This is nibbana with remainder. At death, those aggregates cease and do not arise again. This is final nibbana, or nibbana without remainder. The distinction concerns the presence or absence of the arahant's remaining conditioned aggregates. Final nibbana therefore means that no further aggregates or conditioned consciousness arise in relation to the same unconditioned nibbana already realized during the arahant's life. Nibbana is neither produced when the aggregates cease nor destroyed by their cessation. Theravada consequently affirms neither that a person continues after death, nor that an enduring person has been reduced to nothing. The conditioned basis for identifying and reckoning the Tathagata has ceased. The four alternatives are rejected because each assumes that the Tathagata can still be described as an entity in terms of existence or non-existence. Okay, so that's the Theravada account, but there are still some questions that need to be answered here. If Nibbana is real and unconditioned, what is its relation to the conditioned world? If it is not mere nothingness, how should its reality be understood without turning it into a substance or self? And most importantly, if the Tathagata cannot be reckoned after final Nibbana, is this only because aggregate-based language no longer applies, or does it point toward a dimension of Buddhahood not captured by individual existence? Theravada refrains from answering these questions too positively to avoid affirming an enduring self or the post-mortem survival of an individual, but later Mahayana thought can be understood in part as exploring possibilities that Theravada leaves unexplored. One major development was the Yogacara characterization of liberation, which, rather than understanding liberation primarily as consciousness knowing a separate unconditioned object, understands it as ashraya paravritti, the transformation of the basis. The defiled mode of consciousness, which divides experience into subject and object, is transformed. Thus, awakening is not simply the ending of the cognitive continuum, rather the ordinary dualistic consciousness of samsara is transformed into the awakened non-dual wisdom of nirvana. Furthermore, Madhyamaka argued that both samsara and nibbana, or in Mahayana, nirvana, are empty of independent existence, that neither conditioned existence nor liberation can be grasped as a self-existing thing. From this perspective, the Buddha's refusal to affirm that the Tathagata exists, does not exist, both exists and does not exist, or neither exists nor does not exist, after death, reflects more than the cessation of the aggregates through which a person is conventionally designated. It also reveals the inadequacy of all fixed categories of existence and non-existence when they are treated as descriptions of independently existing things. A Mahayanist might therefore interpret the description of the Tathagata as deep, immeasurable, and hard to fathom as indicating the emptiness of every attempt to define the Tathagata in substantial terms. A more positive Mahayana development thus appears in the idea of the Dharmakaya, or the Dharma body of a Buddha. This means that Buddhahood is not exhausted by the Buddha's temporary physical and psychological aggregates. The historical manifestation ceases, but the Dharma realized and embodied by a Buddha is not simply destroyed with that manifestation. The doctrine of the three bodies, or Trikaya, develops this even further. The Dharmakaya, the truth body or reality body, refers to the empty, non-substantial nature of awareness and phenomena. The compassionate manifestations of the Buddha's truth body, by contrast, are associated with the Rupakaya, the form body, which includes the enjoyment body, Sambhogyakaya, and the emanation body, Nirmanakaya. Buddhahood is therefore not the mere cessation of one personal continuum and has enduring salvific significance, for enlightened activity may continue beyond the death of the historical Buddha. In the Tathagatagarbha traditions, an even more positive development appears. Such traditions speak of an innate Buddha element, luminous awareness, or ever-present capacity for awakening within sentient beings, thereby directly addressing the question of how the realization of the unconditioned is possible within conditioned existence at all. This is also, of course, where the danger of reintroducing a hidden self is greatest, and we recently spent 3 videos carefully peeling back the layers of this very interesting line of thought. If Buddha nature is understood as an eternal individual consciousness, it may well conflict with the Buddhist denial of intrinsic identity. It certainly conflicts with Theravada's refusal to posit an unconditioned awareness outside the 5 aggregates. Mahayana interpreters therefore generally insist that Buddha nature is empty, non-personal, and not an independently existing entity. Finally, Dzogchen speaks of the ground, or ji, as the primordial nature of awareness, which is empty in essence, cognizant in nature, and unobstructed in its capacity for manifestation. Awakening is not the arising of a new Buddha, but recognition of this primordial Buddhahood. The ground is described as primordially pure, kardak, and spontaneously present, lundrup. Primordial purity means that its nature is empty and that it is never intrinsically defiled, and spontaneous presence means that the wisdoms, kayas, and expressive capacities of awakening are intrinsically present rather than added to an otherwise blank emptiness. These 2 aspects are inseparable, and therefore the ground cannot be identified with the unconditioned nibbana of Theravada. Theravada treats nibbana as an unconditioned dharma that is neither the source nor the expressive display of the conditioned aggregates. But Dzogchen's primordial emptiness is not separable from cognizance and appearance. Samsara and nirvana arise in relation to the same ground, differentiated by non-recognition and recognition respectively. Under non-recognition, the display of the ground is experienced through dualistic grasping and thus becomes samsara. Under recognition, appearances are liberated as the display of wisdom and thus become nirvana. Dharmakaya, the truth body of the Buddha, is associated with the primordial purity of the ground. Sambhogyakaya, the enjoyment body of the Buddha, is associated with the spontaneous presence of the ground. And Nirmanakaya, the manifestation body of the Buddha, is associated with the compassionate dynamism of the ground. As such, the exhaustion of ignorance and karmic compulsions certainly does not entail the exhaustion of appearance itself, for on the Dzogchen view, the compassionate awakened manifestation of the primordial Buddhahood is possible precisely because its emptiness was never separate from its spontaneous presence. In the next video, we'll continue this discussion by considering whether the ending of suffering and rebirth can justifiably be called the highest possible Buddhist goal, or whether awakening is better characterized by Mahayana and the Bodhisattva path. For now, if you haven't already, you can go back and watch my series on Buddha nature, where I explore these ideas in much greater depth. Thank you for watching.